I've talked about DNA before, and I decided I'd keep talking about it, but something a little bit different. In terms of forensic DNA evidence, we have several different modalities. The main one is what we call autosomal DNA, which is the most common DNA that's in the nucleus of the cell and which propagates sexually. Hence that pedigree diagram. Your DNA comes half from your mother, half from your father. And the result is that there's a huge amount of mixing over the generations, which is complicating in a way, but also very simplifying. Today, I'm going to talk about one particular chromosome. It's still in the nucleus, and it's this puny little thing called the Y-chromosome. And we choose typically 17 convenient loci on the Y-chromosome, which together are sufficient to be useful for identification in special circumstances. And as you can see, the pedigree diagram is much simpler. As you may know, Y is male only, so women have nothing to do with it. A typical forensic DNA problem is like this. Mr. Russell was alleged to be in the company of this minor girl, and his DNA, something matching his DNA was found there. If it hadn't matched him, he probably would have been exonerated immediately. So that's one reason it's important to match. And the other point is, since he did match, we can't just go into court and say his DNA matches, there's the evidence, because there's an or about DNA, and you say, oh, DNA, lock him up. But we need a number. Is this coincidence, is it a 1 in 4 coincidence that he matches? Or is it a 1 in 60 million? It really makes a difference. So we need a number, otherwise it's improper to present DNA. Now, why the Y chromosome? The problem in these especially sexual assault cases is that the woman's DNA might be present in much larger quantities than the male, and for technical reasons it will therefore overwhelm the male when you do the analysis in the lab. But if you look at the Y, since the woman contributes none, you can see even a very small signal clearly. Now, in my part-time job as a consultant on DNA cases, I don't particularly care if I'm fighting for truth and justice, but it should be one or the other, mainly justice. In fact, it's not my job to fight for truth. That's the court as a whole. My job is to represent one particular side. And I get involved because I publish some papers on Y evidence, particularly with these cases that I'll mention. The FBI, which is very influential in the United States, a lot of you have heard of the FBI, has a recommended method for dealing with Y that is very superficially thought out. And the flaw in it becomes particularly evident when you're dealing with a tribal situation. So a few years ago, there were several cases in succession in which, in these cases, it was always defense attorneys somehow located me, and I testified against the Y DNA evidence being allowed to be used in the trial. So there was a case involving a Hopi Indian, or Native American as we're supposed to say. Another one, a tribe that I'd never heard of called, spelled like that, Tohono O'odham. And there were a couple others, I think. Yeah, there's one that didn't work out so well. And there were even some very enterprising boutique lawyers from Boston that contacted me about some privileged kid who was accused of assault, and the possible defense is, well, he's Ashkenazi, and that's a tribe, isn't it? Maybe. They talked me into at least getting involved in the case. So here's a shot of it's called a karyotype. This is how you can actually see the chromosomes with appropriate preparation, including dyeing, and I think a microscope is involved. And you can see that there's an ingenious naming system for the chromosomes. The biggest pair is called 1, and I'll let you work out the rest of the system, down to 22. And then the X and the Y are kind of special. I suppose in a woman, it's an X and an X. That could be called a pair. But in the case of men, it's an X and a Y, which are clearly not a pair. And you can see that the Y is a little bit on the small side. I don't like to talk about this a lot. And by my count, it's actually a wee bit bigger than the 22. And I think that's important. You don't have to think it's important. Okay, so here's a little shot about the way they diagram the thing. And these lettered positions have nothing to do with the forensic use of the chromosome. They're only apparently visual banding patterns that you can see with a microscope, and which are used as part of the nomenclature to tell people, if you care, where something like a gene on the chromosome is. For our purposes, we don't care. Particularly don't care because we're dealing with a Y, as I may remember to emphasize in a minute. Now, on this chromosome, there are many, many locations, of which we've located and used 17, that have a convenient pattern called a short tandem repeat pattern. In this case of this is an electron microscope that I did myself, a micrograph, and the pattern is TTAC. So the TTAC is repeated a number of times, and that turns out to be an easy thing to assay, to measure. And the number varies from man to man, which means that it's useful for identification purposes. Now, the number of repeats, I mean, it doesn't vary hugely. Typical pattern would be that it varies something like this. So it's equivalent to having 5 equally numerous sizes. So if you only look at one of these 17 locations, it doesn't get you very far. But if you look at 17 of them, well, nominally, you might think that that means you have 1/5 to the 17 chance, negligible chance, for 2 men to match. That would be true for autosomals, but not true for Y. Well, would it be true for autosomal? Let's leave it at that vague statement for the moment. If you have a lot of 1 and 5s, it adds up to a small chance. And let's look at the autosomal genetics. One of the symbols for male is the circle with the arrow on it. I'm curious. I think that comes from astrology. I'm not sure why they decided that was a male symbol or why the other one represents a female. I'll let you know next year if I find out. And each one, at any particular locus, each parent has a pair of chromosomes, and each of the pair may have a different number of repeats associated with it. And when they have a child together, each of them will contribute one of their 2 chromosomes, one of that pair of chromosomes, that is. And in the case of my picture, this pair of parents is able to produce a child that's 15/16 at this particular locus. Locus meaning location. So I'm calling this is the number 12 chromosome. That's what D12 means. And somewhere on the number 12, there's this location called VWA, which stands for a Swedish doctor named von Willebrand, who discovered a disease which this piece of DNA happens to be near to. Then if we look at 2 different pairs among the 22 pairs in the nucleus, then we get more possibilities for the child. And the reason I show you 2 of them and all this is to talk about the mixing. Again, I'm reviewing the autosomal case here. And due to the fact that you only have a half a dozen or so possibilities, that means that every one of them occurs in many millions of copies in the population as a whole. So when you form a new generation, it's going to have about the same frequencies as the parent generation. Just statistically, when you sample from the parents, you'll get about the same proportions as in the children. And as an extreme example, if we compare Caucasians and Japanese, who are separated by tens of thousands of years of evolution, that is, we both left Africa 60,000 years ago, let's say. So we have been apart between the two of us for 120,000 years. Divide that by 20, 30 years per generation, and we have a few thousand generations between us. And over those few thousand generations of resampling, clearly the 14 and 15 alleles have significantly changed, but overall there's not that much difference between Caucasians and Japanese at this particular locus. So if you're doing forensic work and you don't pay attention to whether you're dealing with Orientals or with Westerners, it's not the worst sin in the world. People wouldn't do it, but it wouldn't make a huge difference. On the whole, they have the same alleles, and roughly speaking, the same common ones. So let's see, with autosomal, you have this 5 times factor per allele. Per locus, you have 2 of those 5 times, but you don't really get 25. There's a combinatorial factor of 2 that you have to knock off because there's 2 ways to arrange the parents. Now on the Y, here's the simplicity. Father to son, father to son, father to son, that's all there is to it. Let's see, I put in 2 little curlicues now. They don't represent 2 different chromosomes. I should link them together because they cannot be transmitted separately, and that's the whole point here. They're transmitted as a unit, and that means they're dependent. And if you look at 2 of them, you don't get anywhere near a 1 in 25 chance for matching. You get much closer to the 1 in 5 chance that you get from just 1 of them. So most people in my field who look at this stuff, frankly, go no further in their thinking than that. They say, okay, I have to treat it as a unit, so surely it's equivalent to a monster allele that has not 5 possibilities, but some number, maybe thousands. And they think once having done that, they've reduced it to the already solved problem. But that's not right. This difference, this qualitative difference, has an enormous effect in how things really work. And that's why simplicity can be confusing. Gosh, I'm burning up the time, sorry. Okay, haplotypes are rare, and the result is that the effect of evolution is that between disparate populations, like 2 populations that have been separated thousands of years, you get no types in common. So as a result, over the years, I've migrated in my thinking from following more or less the autosomal idea, where you look at sample data and multiply, to thinking maybe I should give up altogether, to looking at maybe there's an approach from theory. So let's look at the theory. Here's the evolutionary history of the Y chromosome. A man who lived maybe 110,000 years ago, plus or minus a lot, is the progenitor of every single extant male chromosome. He had at least 2 sons, or he wouldn't be the most recent. And the sons had sons, and occasionally a son would have a mutated version of the Y haplotype. Very rarely you would obtain the same mutation combination on 2 different paths. Here's the story of how North America was populated from Asia starting 15,000 years ago. People came in from the north. They dispersed. Apparently they formed tribes. And the net result is, after quite a long time, that if you look at all of the tribes as a whole, you have an accumulation, you have a fairly large number of people, and over this time you've accumulated 15,000 years worth of diversity through mutation. But if you look at any one tribe, like the Hopi, my first client, that's a tribe that, I don't know how old it is, 600, 1,000 years, let's say. So it's got much less diversity. What the FBI does wrong is, they say, well, we don't have data for Hopi in particular, but that's okay. We have data for the Native Americans as a whole. So they assess Mr. Russell's matching by saying, okay, matching among Native Americans as a whole is quite unlikely. Therefore, we have strong evidence against him. But the truth is, the act that he's accused of happened on a Hopi reservation. Therefore, the suspects are almost all Hopi, and that's a new population, and it has much less diversity, and the chance of two people matching is relatively large. For the whole of Navajos, or for the whole of Native Americans, I can count that it's about 1 in 3,000 chance to match. For this group of Indians, I don't know, we don't have the data, but there's some evidence that it could be very low, like 1 in 10. So that man was named Kutsatewa, and he was alleged by the defense, as I understand from the defense attorney, to have misbehaved with some child. There was some woman who she portrays as a busybody who reported him. It's interesting how, it's impressive actually, how much defense attorneys take the case to heart, and indeed prosecutors do the same. So I testified in court to the effect of this stuff, and Jamie and I, the attorney, had practiced our routine, and I hope she wasn't upset that the judge sort of took over the cross-examination. I thought it was great because it showed intelligence and he was interested, and when I said that matching was almost always matching by a lineage connected without mutation, he said, "What percent of the time?" And quoting my 2014 paper, I said 97%, with a lot of assurance. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I had to revise the number down to 90%, which I didn't tell him, which I haven't gotten back to him. In another case, the judge was less impressive, but we think he probably followed the lead of the first judge. And in a third case, and all these guys, they don't look very impressive. They come into court in their, the prison the orange jumpsuit and quite likely shackles. And it all looks pretty sorry, and they're 60-year-old men and somewhat infirm. So Russell, the attorney wasn't even worried about the autosomal evidence, which was extremely powerful on the woman's breasts. She alleged that he'd licked her in this drunken night where there were other people in the room. It was kind of strange. Because he said, well, the fact that the DNA was on her breast could be used as an argument against his having penetrated her. So he wanted to get rid, but he'd be much happier if he could get rid of the Y evidence, which was part of the vaginal swab. He said, I think I could win the case if I could get rid of that except for one thing. And I said, what's that? He said, well, a previous offense. And I said, against whom? And he said, the same woman. I got to tell you how mutation works, because that's where the APL comes in. So we have a Y-haplotype, which we can model as a string of 17 integers, and I start out as the same numbers, but it doesn't matter. They're completely unrelated to one another in terms of functionality. And at each of those 17 loci, we have a mutation rate. In other words, the chance that the son differs from the father. And these mutation rates average 1 in 350 generations. So that comes to a few thousand years between mutations at each locus. But since there's 17 chances, that comes down to more like a few hundred years between changes in a particular lineage. So here's the model for a son. There's a chance in mu that he mutates at all. And if he does, we'll call it 50-50 whether he mutates by +1 or -1. I guess subscripting by query 2 would have been easier. And so the son is the son of a father, and that models the mutation. This implies a few things. The chance of a son being identical to a father is that much, which is 95%. The chance that the son is non-identical to a father, distinguishable, is about 5%. And the chance that brothers are distinguishable is about 10%, because there could be a mutation on either of the events on the event of either brother being conceived. A nice point is that, according at least to this model, in which case plus and minus mutations are equally probable, time is reversible, and that'll be convenient in a moment. There's no difference between the son going, well, we'll see what it means. I'll say no more. Evolutionary model, standard simplest model is called Wright-Fisher, which means that each generation is obtained by sampling with replacement from the previous generation. In this case, I'll allow growth, so my new size is some function of the old size. And so that's the model of the new population. And it's easy to see by, for example, simulations that diversity comes about as a result of accumulating mutations, and you get diversity accumulating over time and according to population size. And let's see the mechanism a little bit to talk about what we need to calculate. Let's suppose that these two men are related. These are two different men, but they're identical in type. And the pattern I'm showing here represents they're having a common ancestor, who is called the most recent common ancestor. And in this case, so each box is the Y chromosome of a man. And the arrows going down are descent. So the common man at the top had two sons without mutation, and those sons had sons, and eventually we get to these two men who are identical by descent. As opposed to the picture on the right, where we have two men who are equally identical, but not by descent, only by state. What happened in this case is they have a common ancestor who had two sons that are different because there was a mutation at the fourth locus on the right. But that was reversed a few generations. That one was not reversed. And the guy on the left, there's a lineage there in which there were a couple of mutations. So by this circuitous route, you came to two guys who happened to match. If we look more closely at the pattern here, then we come to this time thing. Let's copy over these people, and then we'll copy over this guy, and then we'll copy over these others. And now we have everybody laid out in a line, which we can do because time is reversible. So the current day is at the very bottom and the very top. And as we trace down, we see what happens is that we have pairs of canceling mutations. We have one pair for this locus, could have been more pairs, and one pair for the other locus. And now we can calculate. Two types match in general if and only if the connecting patrilineage has n pairs of canceling mutations for some n. Now, when I wrote the slide, I was thinking of n applying to mutations across all the loci at once, but we can equally do it locus by locus, which is wonderful. You can't think of the Y probabilities locus by locus, but you can think of the evolution locus by locus. So that gets you somewhat around that problem. So I wrote a little function, the primitive function, to calculate the chance that two men match for a specific value gen of the generations between them, a specific value n of the number of pairs, 0 on up, between, well, one specific number, such as 0, of pairs of mutations between them. And the only thing I'll say about these formulas is that one of my favorite dot products is the times dot shriek. We calculate the number of places. We consider n shriek gen is the number of, selects the +1 mutations, and n shriek gen minus n selects the positions for the compensating -1 mutations, and then you multiply them together, and Bob's your uncle. Don't have time to tell you who Bob was. Okay, it was the liberal Prime Minister Robert Asquith. Then I can take this thing and put it together with this very nice APL-ish string of outer products. So now instead of considering only a single n, I consider all the n's, and I compare all the possible generation numbers, and I've got, of course, at each locus I've got a mu. And I come out with this huge matrix that I call IBS that has the data I need in it. I now need to collapse it a little bit, and you're not interested in the details, but the times is multiplying across loci there, so the chance of matching IBD is given on the first line. The chance of matching IBS is similar, but first you have to accumulate over all numbers of mutation pairs. That's the plus along columns. And if you're interested, we could subtract one from the other to get what I call strictly IBS, meaning they're identical and specifically with some mutations. So this enabled me some years ago to draw this graph and to show what people didn't seem to understand intuitively. They tend to think that being identical by descent, in other words, purely by being related, is the exception. But it's not. It's very much the rule. As long as the common ancestor is up to 1,000 or even 2,000 years, the red line, which is the identity by descent, is almost the same as the bold green line, the overall total of mutations. The problem with this is that we don't know what point on the horizontal axis is relevant for a typical forensic case. Because if it's here, then the chance of a match between two men is like 1 in 10. And if it's here, the chance is like 1 in 10,000. And a little, let's see, I was impressed by John Scholl's quoting an Irishman, so I thought I'd do the same. Anybody know the Irishman? Those that know, okay, George Bernard Shaw, if you didn't hear. Apparently he was grumpy, so I feel a kinship. Okay, so it's very common. I've got a slew of these things. Forensic reports that say, due to the paternal inheritance of the Y chromosome, all males from the same male lineage are expected to share the same Y-STR profile. All right, well, I would just note that when they talk about same male lineage, literally that means every man alive. And on the other direction, even brothers are only 90% to share. So in that respect, it's an overstatement. So it's an overstatement and an understatement. In summary, it's really stupid. Let's see how much of this I can squeeze in. A lot. They put time on the clock. It was injury time. Okay, let's suppose we have a population that starts on the left with a single man who has, let's suppose, 2 sons, and they have more sons, so the population grows like a trumpet as you move to the right. And let's suppose that we have a particular criminal case, and the circle is the donor's type, and the suspect wants to argue that he only matches by coincidence. So we want to think about the chance that he would match by coincidence. So we trace back to the most recent common ancestor between them, and we consider the same for some other suspect B, and we wonder what the picture is about the time scale for the MRCAs. Well, if we just look at the most recent common ancestor independent of matching, the curve might be something like this, because part of it's obvious. If you think of any 2 random men in modern day, it's 50-50. It's a 50% chance that they're descended from different sons of the progenitor. So there's a 50% chance that their MRCA goes all the way back to the first guy. So clearly, MRCA is dominated by ancient history. On the other hand, if you consider only matching pairs, it becomes more complicated. Because of the people who go back all the way back to the beginning, they don't match. There was way too much time for mutation. And if they've had 5 or 10 or even 2 pairs of mutations, there's a negligible chance that they actually cancel. So it turns out that typically matching men go back, or they're something like 10th cousins or 20th cousins typically. 300 years ago. Here's another graph equivalent to what I showed you before, corrected from what I told the judge. It's only, the red line is only 90% of the total matches, not 97%. And the question still remains how many years back we should go. The purpose of this slide is to point out that this behavior is the opposite of autosomal, wherein the non-red line accounts for the vast majority of matching. So people who are using approximations that are reasonable in the autosomal world are wrong by 8 ways. Here, I don't enumerate the 8 ways. Maybe in another talk I did. So the important thing is to remember that all men are related. Okay, then, let's see. So Nicholas kept working on the sharp plot until it did everything the way I wanted. And here's a graph showing, let's see, what is it showing? How far do I want to go ahead? Okay, I have a population growing at a constant rate, X% per generation, like I showed you before. The matching evidence is going to increase with the population size. So here's the size on the n-axis. And here's the matching evidence. A match of, let's see, 4 means that it's 1 chance in 10 to the 4, 1 chance in 10,000 that 2 random men would match. And this axis says, well, it depends on how quickly you grew the population, how far back it goes. But in fact, if we exclude very recent, ridiculously fast population growth, which I've just done, it doesn't much matter. First of all, look at this line. This line is straight, and it's pretty much a 45. There was a paper of some good statisticians, among the very few, who did some simulations to more or less prefigure this work. And so I roughly confirm what they claimed. They say that this line is a 45. What they say is that the chance, that the strength of the evidence is proportional to population size. What they literally said was the number of men with a particular haplotype is fixed. Thank you. and that implies a 45, and conversely. What actually happens is that the number of men with a particular size does grow a little bit with a population size. Secondly, this line here is close to straight and horizontal, which means that it doesn't really matter how old the population is. So what is the story about this cohort size? Well, here's a better way to look at the same data. The important thing here is that we have a table. So providing the population is reasonably old, let's say if it dates back to 7 or 10,000 years, then what I've changed is on the vertical axis, I've got the number of men who possess, the average number of men who possess a particular type, average number of men who can match. So that means if you have a population of, let's say, 10 to the 5 men, 100,000, what you can tell the court is that something like probably 30 or 40 of them would match the crime scene type. Maybe the judge can judge how likely it is that this particular man is by coincidence one of those 30 or 40. It's difficult because you don't really know what a population is. You don't really know what population size is. But regardless of the population size, the number looks like 30 or 40. The number of men is mostly independent of the population size. And that could be forensically useful. So this extends my own paper and their paper. What I was worried about for years was that in order to answer a question this way, you'd need to consider detailed history of this tribe. Did they go through a bottleneck when they were wiped out by smallpox by the early Americans or by whatever the Spaniard conquistadors wiped them out by, and then grew back? Would it depend on that details that you couldn't possibly have? And the answer is no. It's simpler than that. In fact, with this model, and the computation, and no doubt because we're using cache memory in such an efficient way with APL, we can actually model all the way back to Y-haplotype Adam in less time than it took me to give this talk. Maybe a lot less, I forget. Now, I certainly made some simplifications, and so it's more work is possible. But it's time to walk off into the sunset, so let me try to move on. And a standard disclaimer about support. Thank you.